evening. I'm Shona Liddell, the Pioneer Minister of Dunbar Parish Church. I love the fact that we're handed a sweetie as we come in to talk about public health. So tonight I'm very delighted to be able to introduce to you Dr. David Walsh, who is the Public Health Programme Manager at the Glasgow Centre for Population Health. He's also an honorary senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow. So everyone join with me to welcome David Walsh.
Thanks very much. Thanks for a very warm welcome. The noise makes up for the lack of bodies and all that. So yeah, that's who I am and who I work for. The Centre's a Scottish Government-funded organisation, a research institute basically. And as part of my role, I spend quite a lot of time giving talks in various places. I usually have a bit of a sense of who the audience is, be that if it's students or government people or public health people. I have to say, and don't take this the wrong way, but I've got no idea who you are. So I've no idea if you've got an interest in this, if you work in this area, or just there's nothing else going on in Dunbar on a Wednesday evening, or whether indeed you've been dragged along against your will and you'd rather be at home watching the TV or whatever. So I'm just going to kind of wing it, if that's okay. I'll try and not speak for too long, and then maybe we can explore what people's interests are at the end of the talk. So I was asked to come and talk about health and health inequalities. Specifically, what I'm going to do is give you a very quick overview of health in Scotland, and when I say quick, I mean very quick, just a few minutes, not going into too much detail. I don't want to ruin the ending or give away anything now, but it's very possible I may suggest health isn't all that great compared to other countries. So that goes into a discussion then about what determines good or bad health in any society, and I'll cover that a little bit. And given the title of the talk, I also want to talk about the determinants not just of health, but of health inequalities, so the unfair differences in health between sections of the population. And that includes a couple of specific examples, or what I've rather pretentiously called case studies to kind of illustrate that. And then I'll finish just by talking about what do we do about it, what are the correct policy responses to this issue. Just to kind of warn you that in going through this, there's quite a lot of sort of data and graphs and charts and that kind of thing, so there is a slight risk of a kind of Wednesday evening death by data or death by PowerPoint experience, but what I'll try and do is to go through it pretty quickly. So that way, well, it may still feel like death, but it'll be a quick and therefore relatively painless death rather than some long lingering drawn out hell. Okay, so I'll try and run through this in 25 minutes, maybe slightly more than that, and that should leave plenty of time to do what you want to do. We'll just take from there. Does that sound all right? Because I'm kind of making this up slightly. So, if we're talking about Scotland's health, what do we think of? Well, I suppose you could think of all sorts of unsavoury things, but if you work in public health, you tend to think of headlines like this, the sick man of Europe. As I'm sure you're aware, this is a frequently used headline in the Scottish media. The interesting thing about that headline is that unlike just about anything else you read in the media, it's true. In that if you look at life expectancy statistics for Scotland compared to any other Western European country, we are bottom of the heap, both for men and for women. And part of the explanation for that lies with a much slower rate of improvement over time. So this chart, the third of several hundred I'm going to show you, shows long-term trends in male and female life expectancy going all the way back to the middle of the 19th century. And every red line here is one of the main Western European countries, okay, so England, Spain, France, Germany, Sweden, whatever. If I just highlight Scotland's trajectory, there's 2 points to note. The first is, as the title of the slide says, Scotland has not always been this so-called sick man of Europe. From about the middle of the 19th to about the middle of the 20th century, life expectancy here was on a par with a whole number of other Western European countries. But what's happened in the last 5 or 6 decades or so is that although things have continued to improve, they've done so more slowly than elsewhere, meaning that by the end of the period we are indeed in this position of having the lowest life expectancy in Western Europe. Now, if you're still awake at this point, you might want to point out that the gap in life expectancy is obviously much narrower now than it was, say, 50 or certainly 100 years ago. So does this really matter? And the answer to that is it matters massively, because a difference of whatever that is, 5 or 6 years, at the level of entire countries, equates to a difference of many, many thousands of deaths. So it matters enormously. And it's helpful, I think, just to compare with a few specific countries. So that, for example, is Spain, which starts off with much lower life expectancy, increases much faster, and leaves Scotland behind. These are the 2 world wars, obviously, and there's also an outbreak of Spanish influenza at this period that influences the figures. The trend for Italy is very similar. Starts off much lower, increases much faster, leaves Scotland trailing behind. And even our beloved neighbours in England and Wales have had better life expectancy since round about the First World War. And although it's lost in both the scale and the colour of this particular chart, if you zoom into the last few decades, you again see some evidence of a slight widening of the gap as you go through time, as things improve a bit faster in England, leaving Scotland a little bit further behind. And such is the slower rate of improvement that you can point to all sorts of countries which used to have worse life expectancy but now have better life expectancy than Scotland. You can move beyond Europe to comparably wealthy countries where the same phenomenon is evident, i.e. better and faster improving health. And there are even parts of Eastern Europe where, in relation to male life expectancy, they've been closing the gap, and in relation to female life expectancy, they have already closed the gap. So, I've been going for about 3 or 4 minutes, and I thought excitingly we could have a little intermission with a bit of interactive audience participation. Yay! So, I was going to go back to an earlier graph, this one. Well, this is for male life expectancy rather than male and female life expectancy, and I'm going to show you the trend in life expectancy for one other European country, and I wonder if anybody could guess where it is. It's exciting, isn't it? George has heard this before, so he's not allowed to say who it is. No.
Russia?
It is Russia. And that means I don't get to show my clue, because I have a clue for the ladies. There he is. The world's sexiest mass murderer. So, yeah, this is Russia, and there's a reason for showing this. If you look at life expectancy in Russia in the post-war period, it was low, but sort of increasing. It then entered a period of stagnation, which you can argue pretty convincingly was a reflection of the stagnation of the whole communist system. At the start of the 1980s, President Gorbachev introduced some key public health reforms which had a quite dramatic and immediate impact in increasing life expectancy. But then at the end of the 80s, the start of the 1990s, we had the fall of communism, the rapid implementation of privatisation programmes, and the effective fire sale of some of the main state assets, oil companies, gas companies and all the rest. And the result of that was that a very small number of people became quite obscenely and disgustingly rich. So you're a man that owns Chelsea Football Club, for example. Whereas in contrast, many millions of people who previously had a job for life under the communist system were suddenly unemployed. A staggering number of them, mainly younger working age men, turned to drink, and an incredible number of them drank themselves to death. And the resulting fall in life expectancy was described as the greatest peacetime public health disaster of the 20th century. Why am I mentioning that? Because if you look in the death certificates of the literally millions of people who died in that period, alcohol features as a proximal cause of death in an extraordinary number of them. But clearly behind that there were economic and indeed political factors which were influencing that situation. And so the general lesson about the importance of politics for population health is relevant to everything I'm going to talk about today. I said it was an intermission, I didn't say it was a cheery intermission. Coming back to Scotland, this issue of politics is also very, very important, because part of the reason for Scotland's comparative low levels of life expectancy is that we have the widest health inequalities in Western Europe. So the gap in health terms between rich and poor is much wider here than anywhere else, and that impacts on overall levels of life expectancy. And I can show you lots of different examples. I won't go into the detail. This happens to be a study looking at middle-aged females. Don't worry about the detail. It's basically showing that that gap in health terms between rich and poor is much, much wider here than it is elsewhere. And of course, you can show all sorts of depressing and frankly scandalous statistics about the scale of inequalities within Scotland, of a 13-year gap in life expectancy across the country, depending on levels of poverty and deprivation where you live. And within Glasgow, where we're based, we can show even more depressing statistics of a 16-year gap in life expectancy between neighbourhoods that are only a couple of miles apart. And indeed, such is the scale of inequalities in Scotland that they were featured in this well-known in my world, maybe not in other people's world, well-known publication by the World Health Organization in 2008 called Closing the Gap in a Generation, where they highlighted, using now quite out-of-date data, a 28-year gap in life expectancy, again between two different parts of Greater Glasgow that are only a couple of miles apart. Now, on one level, I always say that this is arguably one of the stupidest collections of statistics ever shown in a report, because what they're doing here is comparing life expectancy for two communities in Glasgow of about 3,000 or 4,000 people with entire countries. So America of 300 million people, India 1.3 billion people. So on one level it makes no sense whatsoever. On the other hand, and in the World Health Organization's defence, what they were trying to do was to illustrate the scale of inequalities both between countries but also within countries. And I think it's quite telling that they used data from Scotland to do the latter. And there's, again in our world, quite a well-known quote in this report saying that it does not have to be this way, and it's not right that it should be like this. Social injustice is killing people on a grand scale. Social injustice is killing people on a grand scale. And it's quite a powerful quote, that. And I'm going to come back to it in about 3 or 4 minutes. So if you're still awake then, could you keep it at the front of your minds? Because I want to compare it with something else. So in summarising all that, what we're saying is that health in Scotland is improving, and it's important not to lose sight of that. Things are getting better and have done for a long time. But compared to elsewhere, we're not doing very well compared to elsewhere in Western Europe. And that's entirely influenced by having the widest health inequalities in Western Europe. It's entirely linked to this slowest rate of improvement in Western Europe, and there are even parts of Eastern Europe which are now catching up with us. So in a relative sense, you can argue things are actually getting a bit worse. Woohoo! You glad you came out? It's cheery stuff. So, how do we kind of explain all that? And to be honest, it's quite easy to explain all that, because within public health there's a very sophisticated understanding of what creates good and bad health in any society, be that Scotland, be that anywhere in the world. And this is an understanding that has developed over not just decades but arguably centuries, and from evidence and studies around the globe basically. And people are you often trying to kind of explain these in terms of models or diagrams or frameworks about what are the health determinants, what is it that influences health. And if you're ever bored or have no life like me whatsoever and you Google models of health determinants, what happens is this, that there's absolutely hundreds and thousands of the things reflecting all the studies, all the evidence, all the research that's been done in this area. If I just pick one of these at random, well, it's not really at random obviously because I've created the slides, but if we pick one of these, this is quite a well-known one, and I'm not going to either take up your time or insult your intelligence by talking you through it, but these are a sort of an explanation of what influences health. The main point to note is that although lots of people, including, for example, right-wing politicians or journalists, often focus on individual lifestyle factors, whether people smoke, whether they drink, your diet and all the rest, because they're obviously so important as proximal causes of many diseases, we know from all this evidence and all this research that these lifestyle choices are governed to a huge degree by the conditions people live in and the opportunities that they have in life. So it's these broader socio-economic factors that are so important. I would argue in relation to this particular diagram that there's a layer missing, and that's what some people refer to as the political economy, which is just a kind of fancy way of saying that it's political decisions made at different levels of government which create the environments, including the economic environment, which health can flourish or not. Russia is an extreme example of that, but everything I'm going to talk about also relates to this importance of politics and health. And indeed, coming back to that quote about social injustice killing people on a grand scale, when this report came out, a political economist based in America called Vicente Navarro, he retorted in quite a well-known paper that it's not inequalities that kill people, as the report states, it is those who are responsible for these inequalities that kill people. So in other words, it's politicians that make the decisions that create the environments, including the economic environment, which ultimately filter down to health. And I want to give you two quick sort of case studies of why politics matters so much for health. And the first is entirely related to the whole topic of this presentation, because it's about inequalities in Scotland and more broadly about inequalities in the UK. So we'll go back to this diagram. The title of this diagram, as you see, says the main determinants of health, but actually when it was first brought out by these people down here, it was actually in a discussion about what are the main determinants of health inequalities. Because clearly it's inequalities, it's differences in these broad socioeconomic factors, what your income is, whether it's a high income or a low income, whether you have a job or not, whether you've been lucky enough to have a decent education, which ultimately filter through to inequalities in health. And a decent example within the UK can be seen by looking at income inequalities as a driver of health inequalities. So since 1979, economic policies employed by UK governments have seen quite a remarkable change in society generally in the UK in terms of a greatly widening distribution of income between rich and poor. So the gap between rich and poor has widened considerably. So this, you can't really see this, but this graph goes back to about the 1960s. And this is a measure of income inequality, the gap between rich and poor in terms of the distribution of income across society. This is 1979, and I often say, I'm sure you're old enough to remember, in this case most of you I think are old enough to remember what happened in 1979, which was this. And particular government policies since then have continued to widen income inequalities across the UK, taking us to the place whereby across Western Europe, the UK is the most unequal country. Comparing more broadly across all of Europe, it's second only really to sort of basket cases like Russia and other parts of the former Soviet Union. Because Scotland is part of the UK, we, alongside other parts of the UK, also have very high income inequalities. And because of the link between income and health that I've talked about, if you put that same trend on a different scale, so that's the same thing I've just shown you a minute ago but on a different scale, and you compare it to a measure of health inequality, so the gap in health between different parts of the UK rather than just the gap in income, you see they go in parallel. If we use a different measure of income inequality, so this is the share of the national income received just by the top 1%, so as a proxy for broader income inequality and the gap between rich and poor, then we can show trends all the way back to the 1920s, when Britain was a massively unequal society. It then became much more equal, again down to about 1979, and has since become much more unequal. And again, if you compare that to a trend in health inequality across Britain, the gap in mortality between different parts of Britain, as the one goes down, the other one goes down, as the one goes up, the other one goes up. So this has resulted, these policies have resulted in what some researchers have referred to as the spatial polarisation of the UK. So a polarisation between different places within the UK. They were speaking about a north-south divide, but also you see it more generally across all of UK society, the emergence of these striking inequalities. And you see them in socioeconomic terms, and as I say, as a consequence in health terms. And what's happening now, we were having a conversation earlier about food banks and all the rest of it, and what's happening now in terms of the quite extraordinary scale of welfare reform and the size of those cuts means that, as the Institute of Fiscal Studies have pointed out, income inequalities are going to widen further, and therefore they'll have a knock-on effect in terms of health inequalities. So we're kind of not in a very good place at the moment in terms of where all this is going. In terms of that spatial polarisation, so-called, you can see, as I said, inequalities just about everywhere. In a desperate attempt to keep people awake and to foster some sort of interest, I tried to find some local examples of this, okay? So this may or may not work because I don't know the area very well, but if it doesn't work, it doesn't really matter, because it's just an illustrative example of what you see basically around the country. So, if you have just woken up, you are still here, you're in East Lothian, and East Lothian generally does better than average in terms of health terms. These are the local authorities, and East Lothian's about the kind of 8th best out of 32 in terms of, this is male life expectancy, but it's similar for female life expectancy. And again, going on about the link between economic circumstances and health, if you look at measures of deprivation, levels of poverty, it's also about the 8th best, because the one is broadly a reflection of the other, if you see what I mean. So what I thought I would do is try and get some data from some national profiles that exist for small communities around Scotland. And what I wanted to do first of all was to show you some data for Dunbar, because I thought it'd be quite a nice way of introducing it. But in these profiles they use very weird geographic boundaries, I don't know why, so it's all a bit odd. So basically I got some data for most of Dunbar. So if you can see the map here, it's sort of the south part, I presume this is still Dunbar, and the sort of the kind of east bit. So I've ingeniously called this Dunbar East-South, because that's all the imagination I have. Anyway, from these profiles you can pull out some data for this area, presuming this area makes some kind of sense to you. And the profiles look like this. Don't worry about any of the detail. It's basically lots of indicators around how long people live, about mortality rates, about health behaviours, and then importantly about the broader economic context around poverty and deprivation, environment, crime, all these kind of things. Okay, ignore this because it's completely unhelpful. But if you take a subset of these indicators, you can say, how does this compare with Scotland? Is it, what's the percentage better or worse than Scotland? And if you do that for this part of Dunbar, which I don't know very well, then it comes out pretty well. Because most of these indicators are generally better than Scotland and quite a lot to a good degree, okay? But within East Lothian, you don't have to go very far to find quite jarring kind of contrast in these kinds of indicators. So if you go to Musselburgh, there's a couple of neighbourhoods, communities, I don't know what you would call them. One to the west, so I've ingeniously called it Musselburgh West. It also covers New Hales, if that makes sense. And one to the east. And if you pull out data for Musselburgh West, it looks very like Dunbar in that most of these things, most of these health indicators, these economic indicators, these educational indicators are all pretty good. But the neighbouring area to the east, well, not exactly a mirror image, is actually remarkably different, and it's right next door to each other. Now, as I say, I don't know these areas, so there could be all sorts of things belying these data, but I know from having done profiling work in the past that you can show these contrasts anywhere you like in Scotland. And the point is just really about the kind of ubiquitous nature of inequalities within the country. And indeed, this all comes again coming back to the fact that in one area there's 3 times the level of low-income related poverty, and therefore health outcomes suffer as well. The second case study I wanted to give you, I'm not going to spend much time on it because it's about Glasgow and it'll be of less interest here, but I'm just mentioning it again because of this issue about politics and health. Relates to what I would refer to as excess mortality in Glasgow, what journalists like to call the Glasgow effect. Have you heard of the expression, the Glasgow effect? It's an expression I really hate, and I would really ask you not to use it because it's extremely unhelpful. But basically it relates to the fact that why Glasgow has much worse health than you would predict from its socio-economic profile, basically. So I'm banging on about the link between poverty and health. The issue with Glasgow is that if you plot a measure of poverty along here and how long people live here, and you throw in some of the main UK towns and cities, you again see what I'm going on about in terms of the greater the level of poverty, the younger people on average will die, because that's the tragic truth. But Glasgow's a kind of outlier in that it's there's this additional excess that people didn't quite understand. And this got into the media quite a lot, and there was all sorts of theorising about what might be driving this, and I'm not going to read these out, but they ranged from sort of sensible theories around measurement and migration and these things, down to kind of less serious things about the weather. And at a certain point, this was in the media a lot, and people were getting in touch with us with their own kind of pet theories as to what may explain these kinds of things. And again, I'm not going to read them out, but these are genuinely proposed explanations. And this reached a point where there was so little sense in it, we had to bring some sense to it. So we did a huge project where we assessed all the evidence for all the more plausible explanations for this. And the reason I'm mentioning it is just that what emerged from that process was that obviously none of this played a part, but what played a part were actually quite a lot of political factors. So this is the report we produced a couple of years ago, and the findings were endorsed by lots of leading figures in public health and elsewhere in Scotland. And without going into the detail and boring you with it, what emerged in terms of the main explanatory factors for this worse than expected health, you can't really read this, so I'll just tell you, was historical levels of deprivation which were still playing a part, actions by local government in the post-war era which made the situation worse, and that was by doing things like building very, very poor quality housing, and then in later periods investing less money than elsewhere in that housing. So people were just living in much worse conditions. Decisions by the Scottish Office in the post-war era in which there was a kind of flawed economic model, and it had a particularly detrimental effect on Glasgow. And then decisions by local government in the 1980s where various processes were undertaken which ignored the needs of the poorest in the city. Lots of other things emerged as well. But as I say, the point is just to say that in terms of this additional aspect of health inequality, again, it's political factors which were shown to be the most important underlying factors. So, before I kind of finish, then, what do we do about all this then, given what I've tried to explain? If you look in the academic literature, or indeed some of the government reports, They always refer to health inequalities, and I would argue conveniently, as very, very complex, which is true, but also a wicked issue. But they don't mean wicked in the sense of being immoral, which I would argue they are, but wicked in the sense that they're very hard to resolve. But actually I don't think that's true, because we know very well what policies would work and what policies are required. But what's been lacking and what is lacking is political will to implement those policies. So NHS Health Scotland, which is the National Health Improvement Agency, but it's about to change its name yet again, so don't worry about the name, undertook a policy review several years ago, i.e. looking around the world to see what policies have been shown to narrow health inequalities. And they produced this report. So the evidence is all there, and they talk about actions at different levels that are required. And I'm not going to go into the detail of this because it's a little bit dull for a Wednesday evening in your leisure time. But they talk about actions around what they refer to as the fundamental causes of health inequalities. So this is basically what I've been talking about. So inequalities in income, in wealth, and also to a degree inequalities in power. And they list various measures around progressive taxation to redistribute income across society, which would be beneficial. They also have sets of policies around what are the kind of broader influences inequalities in terms of housing that I've talked about regulation around food and alcohol, price controls for other harmful commodities, and various other things to do with individuals' experiences of inequalities. But it's these fundamental causes that are highlighted as the most important, and there's lots of other papers and reports that have come out talking about how do we reduce inequalities, and it's about, you can't read that, it's about deriving a fairer share of income, power and wealth through policy, legislation, regulation and taxation. How do we eradicate health inequalities? By reducing the underlying differences in income. You get the idea. So there's lots of stuff out there which is all evidence-based, so we know what we need to do. It's a political will to do it. The other question is who can do it? We're in a world of different layers of government, so who's best placed to do this? So I think the most important answer is that nobody's doing it, and nobody's done it for a long time, which is why inequalities continue to widen. But if you're looking at where power lies, then the most relevant powers are still largely reserved to the UK Parliament, because they have control over the majority of fiscal, economic and monetary policies, the majority of social security legislation, employment legislation and more. And if you'd asked me 2 years ago whether the Scottish Government had a role in narrowing inequalities, I would have said that their hands were pretty much tied because of this. I think it's changed a little bit in recent times. With the most recent Scotland Act, there's been further powers devolved to the Scottish Parliament which are relevant. So they now have some control over income tax bands, for example. They have some pretty small aspects of social security and a few other powers as well. So I think the most relevant powers still are largely reserved to Westminster, but there's actually quite a lot that the Scottish Government could do with existing powers. And I think they've been quite cautious in terms of their use of those powers. And perhaps that's not surprising, because they did make the smallest of changes to the income tax bands recently, which is not really going to have much impact at all. And it had the usual measured response from newspapers like the Daily Mail and the Daily Express screaming about tartan taxes and all the rest of it. So perhaps their caution is slightly understandable. What about kind of local policies? Well, the Glasgow work shows very clearly how local decisions can have a negative impact on health. So I'm not going to go into this, but there's lots of things that local councils can do around planning, around social housing, around using the city deals cash more beneficially, and lots of other things. But it has to be done alongside, and there's again evidence out there of policies that would be effective in narrowing local inequalities. So again, it's about using the evidence that's already existing, that already exists, and has to be done alongside national level change and a political will to implement national level change. So I'm going to kind of stop there because I don't want to go on too long. In trying to conclude all this then, health in Scotland is not very good relative to other countries, but again it has been improving. This is linked to wide and still widening inequalities, which are principally the result of political actions or inactions. And so this whole lesson about the importance of politics mattering for population health is the main point I would make, and that those responses are required at different levels. And by this point you might be quite depressed and maybe wish you stayed home to watch TV after all. I have no idea if that's of interest to you, but as I say, I've cut it short, so that's good. And I'm happy to take any questions or discuss or do whatever you want to do. Thanks for your attention.